Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Caleb Teskey, and today I am joined by a multiple-term senator and former Senate Minority Leader, current Lieutenant Governor candidate from Caledonia County, Joe Benning. Joe, thank you for being here with me today.
How you doing?
We'll find out. I got a little late jump out of bed this morning, but I'm happy to have you here, man. For all of my new guests, I asked that everyone maybe share a 5-minute life story, if you wouldn't mind. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I came to Vermont to live in 1975. I have been a resident of the town of Linden ever since. I am married at the moment to Deb Benning. Shouldn't say at the moment. I plan on being married to her since 1983. And we have 2 children, Emily, who is a paramedic in Stowe, Justin, who is now building impellers for military aircraft as a machinist down in Norwich.
Wow, no shit.
They have, let's see, we've lived in the town of Linden ever since we were married in '83. And my wife is a school teacher. I've been a trial attorney for almost 40 years. And she and I will be married as of October 1 for 39 years. Beyond that, I've served as the town moderator in the town of Linden for 10 years. I've been a trial attorney since 1983, having practiced mostly in the Northeast Kingdom, but I have held court, so to speak, from Sherbrooke in Canada down to Baltimore, Maryland for various things. And I've also been a Rotarian since 1988, serving as president of the Lindenville Rotary Club at one point in time, and have numerous civic engagements and on top of my legislative career.
The list is pretty long here.
It's pretty long. I could go on, but I don't know that any of your viewers are going to want to listen to it for that length of time.
You also served on as the chair of the Vermont Human Rights Commission. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what did you guys work on there?
Well, appointed by then Governor Douglas, and we literally take any cases, the Human Rights Commission still does, take any cases that bring controversy about human rights. So, for instance, if someone feels that they are aggrieved as a result of some activity, especially in the government process, they will file a suit, and it is brought before us by way of a petition. The commission decides whether or not it is worthy of a legal challenge, or whether it's the kind of thing you just want to bring the players in together and have a conversation about what's happening and how to resolve it. The commission during my time, for the purposes of what I think our discussion here today is pertinent to, a complaint had been brought with respect to racial profiling in
the Greg Zillow case. Is this the Greg Zillow? Okay.
I don't even remember what the name of the case was, and I probably wouldn't be able to tell you if I did because it's supposed to be confidential. But I can say that as a result of that case, the South Burlington Police Department began taking data on stops. They had never done that before, neither had any other entity in the state up to that point in time. And we tried to start collecting data on racial profiling and trying to figure out whether we had a problem, and if so, what could we do about it. And I'm happy to say that the parties worked through their differences, and as a result, the Criminal Justice Training Council ended up incorporating new curricula to deal with their recruits, how they were trained, and try to put some, I guess, differences of approach into the perspective of a police officer when dealing with anybody that may not fit the standard white Vermonter image.
And if I'm not mistaken, the results of that data showed that Black people were disproportionately being stopped in Vermont.
At least in South Burlington, for sure. And I would imagine, I have not been party to the data collection since my role, but I would imagine that we found that there was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed statewide.
Now, Joe, you've been a lawyer for pretty much as long as I can remember. Actually, you gave me my first job mowing your lawn, I think, when I was 12. I used to drag my grandfather's lawnmower down from Hazen's house down the street and mow your lawn. What made you decide to get into politics?
I actually was coming back from Portland, Maine on my motorcycle one day. I was with a group of people who you could probably call pillars of their community. There were two bank presidents, one vice president, the owner of an automotive repair shop, the owner of a sand and gravel company, the captain of the St. Johnsbury Police. We were all Rotarians or Kiwanians, filling various roles within our communities. But on this particular occasion, we had spent the weekend in Portland together and were coming back from Portland on a day when it was about 95 degrees outside. So some of us chose to take our helmets off, which was perfectly legal in Maine and New Hampshire. When we got to the New Hampshire Vermont border, I stared across the river at a road sign that said, "Welcome to Vermont." As a Vermont historian, I sat there thinking for a moment, what would Ethan Allen have done in this circumstance? If he was told he couldn't cross the river unless he had a hat on his head while he was on his horse. And it suddenly got me thinking that perhaps we had run astray from what the constitutional intent was when this state was founded. It snowballed from there. I kind of got fired up about the whole issue, ended up bringing a lawsuit against the state of Vermont, which didn't get anywhere, but is on the books as Benning versus Vermont. And it talks about the constitutional ramifications of what the individual had for rights versus what the state had for rights. And then unfortunately, it did not come down my way. But I'm still in that fight to this day, trying to get a different impression upon the state about what the Constitution is supposed to be about.
Mm.
That's what got me interested in politics. I knew the only way to change it was not going to be the judiciary; it was going to be in the legislative process, and here I am.
And I remember the motorcycle helmet debate sort of from when I was really young. That's what dragged you in, huh?
It is.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Now you're obviously a Republican in a state that's really the Congress is dominated by Democrats. What is it like sort of trying to get your ideas through when you're outnumbered like that?
It has certainly been difficult, but there are times when various Democrats join with me in trying to make proposals, and I've always endeavored to reach across the party aisle. My whole take on the system is you can't really enter into a good discussion about making change unless you have buy-in from the various players from the respective parties. I have been many times frustrated because there are certain issues I find very dear that just aren't picked up by the other side.
Would you care
But
to name any of those issues?
well, this helmet question has been one of them, but the other thing that comes down the pike right off the bat is the right to own, purchase, and possess firearms. There's a very big difference between the parties in this discussion, and I'm not sure where it ever began, but I do know that the parties are bound together, as we all are in a society that's kept together by a glue called the Constitution. And the Constitution is very explicit about what your rights are with respect to the right to bear arms. Our state constitution specifically says you are entitled to do so for self protection. That's a little different from the national constitution, which talks about it but doesn't make it as explicit as our state constitution does. Now, all legislators, Democrats, progressives, Republicans, are sworn to uphold and protect the Constitution of the state of Vermont. So when I see people trying to place what I'm going to call impediments in the way of your right to own firearms, that is something that's been very frustrating.
So like how did you feel about the large capacity magazine ban?
I disputed the ban because the standard weapon of this day and age, has a 30-round clip attached to it. And if someone is threatening you with that 30-round clip pistol, or rifle, you have a right to protect yourself. And if you can't match what they have, that's problematic to me. But I'll make it even more current. The current conversation is to place a 48-hour waiting period on your ability to purchase a firearm.
I thought they just stretched that to a week.
If they have, I haven't seen that yet, but nothing would surprise me at this stage. But the point of it is, I personally don't see any difference between a woman's right to abortion and the right to own a firearm. Under the Constitution, in my eyes, a woman has a right to an abortion under the right to privacy. I would never place a 48-hour waiting period before her decision to do so. And now we are facing an explicit sentence in the Constitution, which enables you to protect yourself, and then putting a burden in front of that that's called a 48-hour waiting period on the implication that it will somehow save a life if someone is in a suicidal mode.
Or someone who's looking to commit an act of domestic violence or something, I heard was the other justification.
I see that issue in kind of reverse, because there is a record of a woman out of New Jersey who was being threatened by domestic violence, went to purchase a firearm and was told she had to wait 2 days, and she got killed in the interim. So there is this conundrum, if you will, about people who want, on the one hand, to protect people from dying, which is perfectly understandable, but in effect, it impedes your ability to exercise your constitutional right. And I find that to be problematic for legislators who are sworn to uphold that document.
Do you find a lot of pushback in the Democratic Party on this issue?
Absolutely. I mean, the Democratic Party, the Progressive Party, that they've been leading the charge on placing impediments in the way of someone's right to own a firearm.
All right. And I'm going to tie this into the cannabis issue later, because that's been a big issue among cannabis owners. But that's kind of what I'd like to transition into here, because I know you worked on the legislation, and I know I just interviewed John Rogers, who also seemed to have a big hand in that. And I'd like to know what it was like sort of working on that legislation and how the process went.
Well, it was kind of fun, actually. I came at the whole issue from having been falsely accused of being in possession when I was in high school.
Wow, no shit.
And that circumstance involved me playing in a rock and roll band. I went to a Catholic school.
What do you play, Joe?
Guitar.
Guitar, okay.
And actually,
oh, here we go.
I try to keep it in the office to at least keep my fingers limber, but that's a 1955 Telecaster.
All right.
Anyway, my band was at a practice. We're all basically high schoolers, and we were at a house that got raided by the cops. Now, I went to a Catholic school, and I would guesstimate at the time, this is 1975, I'd guesstimate at the time that about 60% of my classmates were indulging. And I chose not to. That was just my preference. And as a result, I never got invited to the good parties, of course. And most of them probably thought I was a narc at one point or another. But the bottom line was, I took an attitude of live and let live. And if you wanted to smoke, that was no skin off my nose. So fine. So the band was at a house where I did not own the house. And we had a couple of people who were watching us as we practiced. We took a break, and a girl who was watching us came out onto the porch with me, and we were sitting there talking. We had a dog between us, and the dog lived at the house, but neither of us did. And all of a sudden, I'm staring up the barrel of a police shotgun, and a very nervous-looking officer on the other side of that gun thrusting a piece of paper in my face saying, "We have a warrant to search this house." And I just threw up my hands and I said, "Go ahead, I don't live here." Well, they told the girl to take her dog and go home, which I thought was kind of odd because the dog lived in the house, but she wasn't stupid. She got out of there as quickly as possible and took the dog with her. They told me to go back inside the house, which was my first mistake, which I could talk about a little bit later on because I did end up going through law school for this very reason. I ended up back inside the house, and in the inside of the house, in an upstairs bedroom, they found two empty hash pipes. As a result of that, they asked us if we would accompany them downtown to answer some few questions. And of course, being a naive 18-year-old, I said, sure. My parents had taught me to respect the police, be cooperative and polite, and do what you could to answer whatever they had for questions. So they marched us down to the police cars, which happened to be stored behind the church of the church that my family attended for 3 generations. And before we got in the car, they said, we have to put these handcuffs on you for our protection. I didn't think a whole lot about it at the time, except that it seemed weird. And I now understand, of course, that I was actually under arrest. I didn't know that at that moment in time because I just didn't know enough about this process. It took us down to the police station. This is in the state of New Jersey, by the way. We ended up going into the police station, and suddenly I'm behind a little screen with a bunch of letters on the front of the screen, my name, my address, etc. And I was being photographed. They then took me to the fingerprint little machine they had there and rolled my fingers across a piece of paper and preserved my photographs and my fingerprints. Then they handed us a citation. I didn't understand why I was being cited for possession of marijuana when I literally had never held any such thing in my hands before. I went to my police chief in town, who my family had known for 3 generations. And I said to him, I have never possessed marijuana. There's something wrong with what's going on here. Can you look into it? His response was, I'll tell you what, you get your hair cut, join the Marine Corps, and we'll make sure this is never recorded.
Did you have long hair at one point?
I had long hair parted in the middle down to my shoulders. I've saved a lot on shampoo since then, but the bottom line was I fit the standard anti-society, bell-bottom wearing, long-haired, you know what.
So you got profiled.
That's a good way of putting it. And so did the house that got raided because they didn't like the fact that rock and roll music was being played from there. And as I look back, the 1-bedroom window upstairs had an American flag in it hanging upside down. That probably was the clear indicator that we were antisocial people who needed to be intervened with. So we ended up, my parents thought I had gone over to the dark side. And my neighbor, who was well known in the community as the local drug dealer, literally went to my parents and said, there's got to be something wrong here because your son has never had any affiliation with marijuana at all.
So a drug dealer went and told your parents that you were totally scot-free.
Yeah. So my parents suddenly realized, hey, maybe we ought to get involved in this conversation. So here's what happened. They came with me to my arraignment, along with all of the other folks who were busted at that house. The police, the prosecutor came to all of us and said, look, we don't have the evidence back yet from the court, from the lab. I would learn later that was a euphemism for we don't have any evidence. But at the time, we all respected what they were telling us. The prosecutor said, we'll make a deal here. If the owner of the house will take a $50 fine, we will dismiss the charges against everybody else and call it a day.
That's it? $50?
Yeah. This is back in 1975, mind you.
That sounds like a deal.
That was a hefty thing, but for the rest of us, yeah, that was one hell of a deal. We wanted to get out of there as quick as possible. But what happened was we went down to the police station afterwards, my parents and I, and we physically watched the cop who was in charge of the investigation take my file with my photographs and fingerprints, tear it up, and throw it into a garbage can. And his last words were, as far as we're concerned, this never happened. Now, the experience of all that was quite traumatic. It burned a memory into my brain that literally drove me later on through 3 years of law school. This is where things get really quirky. At the end of my law school days, I was sitting in the law school library filling out an application to take the bar exam. And one of the questions was, have you ever been arrested? Well, I thought initially, the cops said, as far as we're concerned, this never happened. So the board of bar examiners is never going to find out anything about this. But I paused and I went back down to New Jersey and I went back to that police station and I asked, do you have anything on me? And lo and behold, they pulled out a file from 1975, complete with my photographs and fingerprints. I had to go through a legal process in New Jersey called expungement. Vermont had no such system when I got to the Senate. I went through the expungement process, and in the state of New Jersey, their process says if you are successful in having your record expunged, you may legally declare that you have never been arrested. So back to the bar exam. I knew I had the power to say I've never been arrested, but I filled out the exam by saying I was once arrested, but the case has been expunged. And by law, I am entitled to say I have never been arrested. But I want to be transparent about answering this question. They let me into the bar once I passed the bar exam, so that was not an issue. But
did you pass on your first try?
I missed it by 3 points, which is, there's another story behind that.
I won't hold that against you.
Well, there's a story behind it because this was at the very time where one of the bar examiners happened to be using the reverse application of rating. So it was a 1 through 10 rating system, 1 being the highest if you answered the question correctly, and 10 being the lowest. But this one particular bar examiner was using it in reverse. So did I actually fail or not? I don't know. But I will say that in not passing that first time, I learned a great deal more about the black letter law than I would have had I gone through sailing on the first time around. So I don't look back at that. In fact, this is literally true. I created 375 index cards and I memorized every single one of them before I took the bar exam the second time.
Oh, shit.
And as a result of that, I managed to pass with flying colors on that occasion. But it's a funny joke with my wife and I. We weren't married yet, but we were living together. And literally, I had these index cards all over the house, all around the top of the shower. Everywhere I went in the car, we were going through these cards and memorizing them. You asked me today what one of them said, I couldn't tell you, but back then it was a valuable experience for becoming a lawyer. So anyway, on with the conversation. I end up in the legislature. And the very first bill I worked on was an expungement process for Vermont.
Which I have been a beneficiary of. So, yeah.
Well, as of last, 10 days ago now, I checked. And since 2011, when that bill passed, 43,109 cases have been brought successfully to expunge records.
Wow.
I look at that as one of my shining achievements in the
legislature. And that wasn't an option at all before you got this bill through.
That's correct. So if you are, even today, a grandparent who had a possession of marijuana charge, for instance, when you were 17, and that has kept you from chaperoning your grandchild's school trip because you can't get past a record check.
Oh.
You've got the ability now to clean that all up and change your life for your grandkids' benefit.
What about a guy like my dad, who you apparently knew growing up a little bit, who has felonies for this? I'm sure you're familiar with the Billy Greer case a little bit,
Yep.
but what about a guy like that? with felony international drug trafficking kind of charges.
The problem with your dad's situation, as I recall it was a federal offense.
Yeah,
This offense I'm talking about is a state offense, and
I
the
got
state
you.
of Vermont has control over whether it expunges or not. I don't believe the federal government has such a system.
Mm. Would you like to see them have such a system?
I do think it is appropriate. I mean, it's the same concept, whether you're federal or state convicted. There are records that should be removed from the books once you have quote unquote done your time. There's no point.
Or once your state is, sorry to interrupt, but like if your state is about to start making money off the tax revenue from cannabis, shouldn't we dismiss all of those convictions?
It depends on what the conviction is.
Sorry, not all of them, but a lot of the low level possession offenses and stuff like that.
Yeah, I have always thought that marijuana, cannabis, should never have been a controlled substance according to the federal government. Having it as a level 1 controlled substance means a whole lot of things that are impeding the ability of anybody to be in the retail business right now. So if I was running for a federal office, which I'm not, I would be advocating for the removal of that from that particular designation.
Right on. I want to ask you a little bit about our medical program here, and I don't know how much you know about this, but one thing that really dragged me into this story was when I saw that all 5 of the medical dispensaries in Vermont had sold off their licenses to out-of-state companies. And that was something that was really concerning to a lot of the people who are trying to get into this industry as well. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
We worked very hard in the committee process to design something that kept everything we could in state. It is a problem when you have out-of-state conglomerates, potentially out-of-country conglomerates getting involved in these situations, because it immediately brings in the question of, is this a drug cartel you're dealing with? We did not want to have anybody who was in possession of one of these licenses as being dominated or controlled by an out-of-state entity. So we worked really hard to try to make the rules fit that desire. I don't know anything really about the medical situation because that was before my time in the legislature.
Well, I believe this was 2015 when they started selling them off. 14.
The medical licensed facilities were created before my time.
Gotcha.
And if they have done that, sold off their licenses since I've become a legislator, I'm just not in that loop.
Well, so for instance, the dispensary in Montpelier, Vermont Patients Alliance, and the one in Brattleboro, PhytoCare, were both sold to a company called Curaleaf, which is owned by Russians, which are under sanction right now. So that brings up a kind of an interesting question about whether or not we should be allowing these companies to operate in Vermont.
I would say if that is all true, that it's worth a look. And okay. I am not in that loop anymore because I'm out of the Senate as of January 1.
Maybe I'll bring it to your office sometime. We could chat.
Well, if I get elected lieutenant governor, it's a conversation to be had.
Okay.
Come to that office.
I absolutely will. Now, let me ask you this then. What are your goals sort of as a candidate for lieutenant governor?
The lieutenant governor, it's important to first identify what they actually have as a job description, because most people get confused about this.
Yeah, please explain it.
Well, my opponent, for instance, has been talking in a much higher platitude. And in all frank reality, he's looking to run for a higher office, and he's using.
And we're talking about David Zuckerman.
That's true, and I think he even will admit to you that this is a temporary job for him. In my, I'll call it skeptical observation of his running now, he's using this as a placeholder to keep him in the public eye until 2024, when 2 important events could happen. Those 2 events, I'll just pause here to say, Phil Scott could step down. David's already run for governor once. And I know.
And he got crushed in that election.
Yes. And I know his mentor, Bernie Sanders, His term is up in 2024.
Yeah, he's looking old.
My bet, frankly, is that David wants the Washington position, not the Montpelier position.
Mm.
But be that as it may, it's important to know what the job description is of a lieutenant governor. You have three responsibilities. The first is you moderate the Senate's daily meetings. That's basically banging in the gavel, going through the process of the calendar and how to deal with the items that are on the calendar, moving them through the system, and then banging them out of session. That's one function. It is a position that I, as 10-year moderator in the town of Linden, former chair of the Human Rights Commission, former president of the Lindenville Rotary Club, and president of the Linden State College Foundation, I know how to run a meeting, so I think I've got that covered fairly well. Plus, I've listened to 3 different lieutenant governors along the way and have understood the cadence and the rhythm that you need to get that flowing from the podium. The next official description in the job title is that you have to be a member of a committee of 3. That committee of 3 is called, oddly enough, the Committee on Committees. It places each senator onto their respective committee assignments and also positions the chair of each of those committees. So I would have to participate in the conversation of who do we got here? Where do they best fit together? What's their experience? What do we think they want to do themselves? And how do you make all that mix into committee A has this number of players and this is going to be the chair? I've been there for 12 straight years, especially through COVID when we were faced with our most difficult session since 1836 when we were formed. Dealing with all of that legislative process on Zoom was incredibly difficult. And so I got to see the best and the worst of people along the way.
Were you one of these guys who said it would have been better if we could have met in person? Because I know there were some people who said we need to stay safe and stay at home. And there were some people who said this process doesn't work unless we're like together.
I said both along the way. I mean, let's go back in time to March of 2020. We had a rapid increase of people in our ICU bed spaces. We had no idea what we were facing. We were trying to take the science that we had in front of us and use it to the best of our understanding. And social distancing became the norm and mask wearing became the norm. It was a frightening time period where none of us really, frankly, knew what was going on. So I reacted the same way the vast majority of Vermonters did and thought we had to practice social distancing and wear masks, and probably being in the building was not a good idea. Because even prior to COVID, that building was a petri dish for virtually every flu and cold and whatever you want to name it going down through the years. People always ended up sick in some fashion or another who were working there all winter long. Having said that, there became a point in time where I realized that the emergency was over, so did the governor. And at that point, I began to push back in the other direction, saying, we've got the bed spaces, we have the personal protection equipment, we have the ability to get off Zoom, and frankly, we have not produced our best work product on Zoom. And so as a result, I started to push back and say, let's get back into the building.
So is it fair to say you're a guy who is willing to change your opinion from time to time when you're presented with new information?
I think that's a very fair assessment of who I am, and I've done that several times through my career. A couple of occasions when controversial issues would pop up, I would sit down and have a heart-to-heart chat with my wife, who was usually on the other side, and most often was correct, and I was wrong. So evolving is an important part of my DNA.
Do you find your wife helps you make better decisions?
That is an understatement of major proportions.
And sorry to put you on the spot there.
Well, no, I will let out a secret here. First, she's a Democrat.
Oh, and, boy.
A tried and true Democrat. And every op-ed piece I have ever written, and I've written dozens of them.
I've seen some.
Not one of them has gone out the door without her reviewing it first. We may end up changing it as a result of the discussions that follow. We may not. But I have always tried to make sure it gets a thorough reading from someone who might be on the other side of the issue.
you know, I was just reminded of sort of during this January 6th thing and this Donald Trump stuff. I saw some of your comments on Facebook, and it was cool because I noticed that you engaged with a lot of people on Facebook, which a lot of people, no offense, your age, don't do. Um, and I thought that was really cool of you, where it seemed like you were sort of distancing yourself from this new Republican Party and trying to point out the merits of the old Republican Party. And I was wondering if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, I will start by saying that every Republican has five core principles. We believe in individual liberty. We believe in personal responsibility. We believe in a free market economy. We believe in a smaller government that brings less taxes and a more efficient government, which brings less taxes. And we have a belief that we need an educational system that gives every student, if possible, the ability to compete in a global marketplace. Those five core principles are wrapped together by a constitution that we are fervent believers of, but that's what binds us together as the Republican Party. When you go beyond those five core principles in the Constitution, you get into social issues that splinter us like no tomorrow. But I will say, I believe the Republican Party, on an issue as controversial as abortion, is the only party that has both pro life and pro choice individuals within the party because they believe in those five core principles. When it came to Donald Trump, we fractured again. We have people who were very, very committed to him. We have people who were very, very opposed to him. And right now, as we're progressing through this election, I've been going around the state to Republican gatherings pleading for us to remember that we have those five core principles and it's time to move on from 2020. It has caused a lot of heartburn in a lot of places. When I wrote that series of op-ed pieces, there were people who took great offense to that.
Yeah, I saw some
And
of the comments coming in on your Facebook, and you know, I thought you handled yourself really well, and professionally dealing with those comments.
I appreciate that. They continue to this day, and they are in different places. But there's a certain core group of people who believe the Republican Party should be nothing but Donald Trump, and as a result, they let's just say they have a hard time voting for me, even if they held their nose as much as possible to do so. It's a problem.
Do you feel like the Republican Party has lost its way in a sense?
I think it's one of those fracturing issues that eventually will go away. And it goes away as we approach 2024 if there is another candidate or if the Trump faithful recognize that he now brings into the next election so much baggage that even they can't support him.
Mm. That's going to be interesting to see.
It will
I,
be a challenge.
I'd like to dive into the cannabis a little bit here, just because that was some great background, by the way. But one of the big things we talked about on the phone was sort of this idea of roadside safety, which I know Phil Scott was very keen on, and I think really sort of held this bill up for a number of years. But I want to ask you, first of all, this is a quote from you in the Burlington Free Press in 2018. You said, "You don't have a connection, a nexus between what the result of your test was and whether you were actually under the influence." And this is a quote from the NACB, which was the consulting firm hired by the state for the CCB. He said, "There's no consensus across the board to what impairment looks like scientifically. And yet the state is still training new drug recognition experts to detect signs of impairment from cannabis. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this issue."
I guess I'll start by saying science continues to evolve. There was a time when we had no such thing as a data master test for drunk driving, and police officers were trained to make observations of people and ask questions of people in order to get them to a point where they could be prosecuted for drunk driving. Through time, machines were developed to take a breath sample and translate that into a point of intoxication
Do you
that
remember
could be.
when the breathalyzer came into play?
It was during my career, actually, so it has to be since 1983. I don't remember exactly what
Okay.
year, but prior to my legal career, it was common knowledge that the way you got somebody convicted was you say to them at the roadside stop, "Hey, have you been drinking tonight?" in a kind of friendly way. And of course, the responder would be, "Yeah, but I just had one or two."
Yeah, I just had two
And
beers.
and you get into more questions. Oh, where were you drinking? You got anything in your car that you're drinking? What did you have to eat in the last 24 hours? What position were you in when you were drinking? Where were you? Who were you with, etc.? Those questions all added up to answers that enabled a prosecutor to submit a information against them and get them into court. Through the years, they've come to rely more and more upon the scientific test as the scientific test got improved to a point where it actually could detect a person's level of intoxication. When we were first talking about this particular subject, cannabis, there obviously was no machine available at all, but companies have been falling all over each other in
Yeah,
competition trying to get
they're
this developed.
they're
And
trying.
eventually they're going to get it. That's just a matter of time. But in the meantime, you have people known as drug recognition experts that are being trained to ask all the right questions. And they're the same questions, different topic, but the same questions that were asked 40 years ago about people who are driving drunk. So that process continues.
Mm.
There are ways a criminal defense attorney would cross examine a drug recognition expert to challenge whether they really have a scientific result.
Well, one of the I understand that the state police have like a 12-point checklist that they use to determine that, and one of the first steps is ruling out other medical conditions, and it
Right.
raises the question: Are police um are they qualified to rule out medical conditions?
I will say again, and I'm not going to give up any trade secrets, but there are ways to challenge what a police officer presents when you get
Sure.
into court.
And do you think it's fair to use these same tests, because they're basically using the same test for alcohol, which has a very scientific basis? And I agree that those tests are pretty accurate. But now it seems they're using that same set of procedures for cannabis. Do you think it's fair to apply those same things to cannabis?
Not necessarily, but again, I'm not going to give up any trade secrets.
Mm-mm. It's fair enough. I just it seems like we're making sort of one size fits all approaches for things that affect everyone differently, clearly.
That's been the tradition through time. Try to use a single paintbrush to paint a picture. And the reality is, with each and every individual you're dealing with, a different paintbrush should be used.
Right, because I've met guys who could drink 15 beers and still drive straight. I've met people that take two shots and they're falling over.
Those are the very same arguments we used when these machines were first being developed. And we're using the very same arguments now with the new machines for cannabis
Mm,
purposes.
fair enough. Have you handled any DUI cases for cannabis?
Yes.
Yeah. How
Most often, most often my client gets a deal they can't refuse. And that's how it's resolved.
mm, uh, I gotta my notes are a little out of order here, but I wanted to ask you about sort of it seemed like there was a lot of pushback in the House from what I heard from John Rogers when you guys were trying to get this legislation through. He said the Senate was pretty much agreeable to a lot of things, and a lot of the pushback came from the House.
Yeah. I think looking back, as I recall, I think we went through two sessions where the Senate had passed a legalization measure that got bounced back. And at least one session, we got a bounce back on the tax and regulated system. But it has always been the House that has been the more difficult body to get this legislation through.
Hmm, really? And even though Zuckerman is now sort of your opponent in in the lieutenant governor thing, or maybe he's leaving, but what was it like working with him on this legislation?
Well, we came at it from two different perspectives. In his case, he wanted to be able to partake legally. In my case, I wanted to treat this whole subject much differently than a criminal prosecution. So, in my case, I still don't smoke. I don't have any care or desire to. And I made it very clear to people who were in my party getting angry with me about it that I had no desire to own a retail establishment. I was accused of that on several occasions, that I just wanted to make money off this process.
I asked my dad about it, and he said you didn't want nothing to do with it. You were just a guy that rode a motorcycle.
That was exactly where I was. And having said that, though, I recognized we had a constitution in which we were all entitled to this concept called liberty. And you don't take somebody's liberty away from them without having real justification for doing so. And I never saw cannabis consumption as justification. So Rogers and I on committee, we were aiming for the same objective. We just came at it from different perspectives. But that's part of the legislative process. When you work across the aisle, you may have very wide differences on why you're in the room. But if
Well,
you've got a similar objective, that's really important.
well, John seems like a guy who's also willing to work with people across the aisle, and he seems like a pretty reasonable guy. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say that's a very fair assessment. I would say when he felt his own party was in the wrong, he let them know that. And that's not much different than what I was doing when we were talking about Mr. Trump.
Mm. And I really actually liked your comments there, because I thought a lot of the Republicans were just getting way too far off to the side, and it was nice to hear a little bit of reason from you there. Um, I also wanted to ask about sort of like I still see a lot of this sort of reefer madness, sort of fear. I call it fear porn, where people are saying, "Oh, the kids are going to get more access to cannabis if we open up retail dispensaries," which I'm sure you've heard some of those arguments, and I'm wondering how you feel about those arguments.
Well, for me, Caleb, those arguments started back in the early 1970s around my family's dinner table. There was a
Yeah.
very big difference between my parents and I when it came to this subject. I knew at the time the bulk of my classmates were partaking. There was never any harm. There was never anybody getting addicted to more serious substances. So the arguments that were being raised, I knew from experience, were just not true. Their arguments were centered on fear and the unknown. And that continues to this day. In fact, I look around at some of the people making those arguments, and I can hear my father to this day. And it's something that I have to sit back and say, his problem was that he just didn't have enough information.
Or
The
that
time,
they've been fed misinformation, maybe.
no question about it. But it was easier for them to accept that misinformation because their whole position was based on fear, and they were looking for a reason to be opposed to it. And that misinformation fed right into that. I'm sitting here thinking about it. That's a whole nother story about the state of my party.
We'll do that on the follow up.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, this is the biggest issue that has come up in the cannabis legislation, is the THC caps. And I don't know who proposed this or what, but I know the Vermont Medical Society was proposing a 15% cap on THC for flower. And then they were proposing a 60% cap on THC for concentrates. But I know guys that are making concentrates well into the 70s, and guys that are growing flower, they've raised the flower cap to 30. But I know guys that are testing at over 30 right now, and it seems like sort of they're punishing people who are really good at growing this plant. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it falls into the category of people who are considering the subject who just don't have enough information yet. They are reacting, trying to be safe. And that's an understandable human reaction. But when they don't have enough information, there's a wide range of differences as how people approach this subject. Our committee took hundreds of hours of testimony. I should say my committees, because I was working on both government operations and judiciary. And both committees were going around the state taking all the information we possibly could. I will credit some of those growers you're talking about. I laughingly refer to them as guerrilla farmers, but they are quite skilled at what they are doing. They are frustrated because they are dealing with people who don't have the information they do. And that's just part of human nature for a politician to want to be failing safe. Unfortunately, it has put interesting obstacles in the way of people who know what they're doing. And I know that from a grower or a retailer's perspective, that can be very frustrating. It's going to take time. People are going to understand eventually. But you have to know that we were starting with Colorado only. And in Colorado, you would take somebody who's consuming an edible and then would not get the immediate effect that they would from a cigarette form. And then they'd take another edible, trying to figure out when the high is coming. And the next thing you know, they're in the emergency room. And that's one of the things that drove a lot of the opponents into the room to say, no, we can't do this. So that fear factor is a powerful factor, and you have to deal with it over time and through much more information.
You know, and I read that study that has been quoted by the Department of Health a number of times. And the way they count those studies is very strange because it was from Colorado and say it's from a number of states also, but this was started by the DEA about 12 years ago. And they started doing this survey. So if you come into the hospital and you're overdosing on Oxycontin, let's say you're just overdosing. If you have a prescription for Oxycontin, they're not going to count that in the study. But if you smoked a joint outside, since that's an illicit substance, they will count that in this. So if you come in and you're overdosing and you say, I took Oxycontin and marijuana, they're going to say, hey, if you have a prescription for Oxycontin, that doesn't count in the study. And I believe that kind of reporting is skewing the data in a way that makes it look like cannabis users are, more subject to sort of these dangerous situations.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I think the methodology is still going through a metamorphosis, but it's another reason why this shouldn't be a conversation at the state level. It should be a conversation at the federal level where all people and our best scientists are able to come to some kind of consensus. But so far, you haven't had the federal government on board with doing that. It's a simple question from a legal perspective of what jurisdiction offers you the best remedy to this very problem. And I've never thought Vermont was the place to try to do it on its own. It needs to be a broader conversation.
Fair enough. I'd like to ask you about safe injection sites. What's your stance on that issue?
So the evidence that we had before us in Senate Judiciary was one location, Vancouver, had instituted safe injection sites, and that the evidence seemed to suggest it was certainly improving the numbers as far as how many people were overdosing. You were decreasing the overall numbers. But they had yet to determine what the outside impact of that was on the system in general. I don't think we yet have enough information before us to make me want to say, yeah, this is a great idea. And unfortunately, this discussion comes at the same time where you're having a very large group of people saying, we've got to defund the police. The most obvious location for any kind of an injection site would be in the highest populated area in the state.
Yeah, Burlington. That's where the argument usually comes from.
Well, that if you take a look at Burlington right now, there is a disturbing rise in shootings, drug activity, homeless people. So you're not going to get a lot of support in the legislature for this concept at this time when we don't have enough information to support why it should be in the first place.
Have you guys looked at the Portugal model?
If you're going to declare all drugs as no longer criminal, that's what I understand the Portugal model to be, you are requiring a major cultural change. We certainly have never looked at Portugal enough or considered the ups and downs of that as a legislative body to make a determination at this point. I suspect we will eventually move in that direction, but you and I are a long way from that being a successful conversation in the Vermont legislature.
Do you think a major cultural change might be what we need to solve this problem?
I do know that what we have been doing hasn't worked very well. So, is there another answer out there? The answer for those who would be proponents of that is very simple. You go right to it. But to a group of legislators who are 180 in total, and they come from varying districts with constituencies that range all over the place on this, having a successful conversation to get there, you and I are a long way from seeing that happen.
And I know Vermont really has had an issue with finding space for people to go to rehab, finding beds for people that are trying to get clean. Do you have any idea where we're moving in terms of that issue?
Slowly but surely, we are moving in the right direction. And I'm going to use Jenna's house in Johnson as the classic example. We are currently housing women at the Chittenden Correctional Facility for roughly $80,000 a year. Jenna's house, you've got a very dedicated family hosting about 10 to 12 folks who are coming off of addictions or working their way to get off of addictions.
And their daughter died of an overdose. Is that correct?
That's correct. So they labeled this program Jenna's House after their daughter, Jenna. They are absolutely committed to making the lives of these individuals better and to bringing them into society as productive members of that society. That's the direction we need to be moving. And for your viewers who don't know, it's a wraparound community. They have the medical needs, they have the therapeutic needs, and they have the people who are willing to develop skill sets in these individuals so that they get out of the program with skills that enable them to become productive members of society.
And they have childcare services. I just want to throw that in there.
With housing. So you put all that package together. How are they doing that for 12 grand a year? That's a really good question. So I am very pleased to see Democrats, progressives, and Republicans looking at that model and saying, you know what? This is a good idea. We got to replicate this throughout the state.
So you guys are looking at, you've taken note of that model.
Oh, yes. Everybody who has gone through that building, it's more of a complex, actually, but everybody who has gone to take a tour has come out of there really impressed with what they see. So replicating that model, as opposed to throwing women who are addicted into a criminogenic setting like the Chittenden facility, which is first off falling down as we speak, but is also housing some pretty dangerous criminals. That environment is just not conducive to achieving the objective we want to see.
So we're putting low-level offenders in with serious criminals.
Exactly. Not the direction you want to go.
And now, as a lawyer, Joe, you spent a lot of time in and around courtrooms. I'm sure you've handled drug cases. What has it been like dealing with, I mean, you got to deal with your client and then you have to deal with prosecutors and the judge. How is it like navigating that as a lawyer?
It has been very challenging, but a rewarding and worthwhile career, because you learn a lot about society that you never would have otherwise. But my past 40 years, I just entered file number 4,115. That's the number of case files I've had over the past almost 4 years.
So like 100 a year or so?
It's in that vicinity, maybe a little bit more.
So one every 3 or 4 days. That's a lot.
You take a look at my incoming email notices and you would know why that is the standard. But the bottom line is you meet a lot of people with a lot of different challenges. And as you go through your career, you recognize you're doing your best to help people all along the way. And when you navigate the system, judges, prosecutors, police officers, social workers, that is a challenging system, but it is the best system in the world as far as I can see. And I like being a part of that system.
Hmm. Have you ever had any cases that you won where you were like, ah, yes?
Oh, yeah, lots of times. One of my earlier cases featured a woman who was charged with 27 counts of cocaine transportation. There were three co defendants, and the other attorneys who were on that case representing the other three were far more experienced than I was. One of them got out right away because he had a legal issue that was successful in his case that wasn't in the remaining three. But I flew in an airplane every day over to Burlington to deal with this case with another one of the attorneys. And we went back and forth for, I think it was about a 3 week long trial. And every day we would compare notes about what happened in the courtroom. At the end of it, the jury brought back a verdict convicting his client and acquitting my client on all those charges. That was one of those days I went home and I said, I got something going here, and I left.
Oh, that must be a good feeling. I bet there's a lot of kind of disappointment in the courtroom when you're a lawyer.
Sure.
Yeah.
There are many places where you are dealing with people that have done some pretty horrible things. You're still charged with having to represent their interests because that is the only way we can keep an adversarial system in place. I can't be the judge and jury of my own clients.
Mm.
My job description then requires me to advocate for my clients' interests. And part of that is challenging the state because the state has the burden of proving them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I've always liked that challenge, but there are days when I might have been successful and I walk away thinking, I'm not sure what good I've just done for society other than protecting that system. And I know I have to protect that system because that's my job.
Mm. Great point. I just got a couple more here for you, Joe. One of the last points I had was just the number of seats that are open this year in Vermont politics. It seems like now is kind of a big shakeup, or at least an opportunity for such a thing to happen.
COVID-19, I put my finger squarely on that. It exhausted a lot of the people who were in the building. And as I look at my own senatorial career, I felt like I had reached a plateau. And so it was time to move on. I don't have any desire to be in that chair when I'm no longer useful or no longer welcome or both. So I felt like I was ending at a high point in my career, and I really appreciate the opportunity that the citizens of this district have given me because they placed their trust in me.
You're killing it. It seems like you've won every election pretty handily.
I like to think so, and I can only say I'm not entitled to any position I get. I have to work to gain the people's trust.
Look, I know lots of Democrats that voted for you, Joe.
I'm hoping my wife was one of them. But the bottom line, Caleb, is if you can appeal to the majority of the people, you may not have an agreement with them on every issue, but at least if you can leave them walking away saying, I disagree with Benning on this, but he took the time to listen.
Well, I'll tell you what, like
both sides.
During COVID, when I was trying to get my unemployment, you were the first person that actually responded to one of my emails and tried to help me. I emailed Bernie. I emailed Peter Welch. I emailed a lot of people, and you and Marty Feltis were really the only two people that got back to me. So I appreciated that.
That's a big secret to this job is you try to be responsive to your constituents.
Yeah, and I know a lot of Republicans typically rail against these sort of entitlement programs or whatever. But it was really nice that when I needed some help, you actually responded to my emails and got on the phone with me. So I appreciated the hell out of that.
That's good.
Cool. Well, I'm out of questions for you, Joe. Thanks for this picture of my dad here. That was super cool. I always leave the
Hey,
last.
wait a minute. Wait a minute. You just showed a picture of me with hair.
Oh, there. Oh, shit. I got the fake green screen, so it's not coming in so well. Wow.
All right. Well, I'm in the upper left-hand side there with some hair on my head.
I always leave the last word for my guests, though. So if there's anything else we missed or that you'd like to say, this is all you, Joe. Thank you so much for your time, man. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it. As you know, I'm running for lieutenant governor, and that is a very long and hard road. I don't have any misgivings about the obstacle that's in front of me. So if any of your viewers happen to have more interest in who I am and what I'm all about, go to joebenning.com and you'll learn more than you ever wanted to know.
Very good. Thank you so much, Joe. I hope we can do this again sometime down the road.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity.
Peace.